Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, more than 100 days since the war on Gaza started, the humanitarian catastrophe is deepening. The life is being choked out of the Palestinian economy. Also this week, Israel's bombing of the Strip is seriously damaging the nation's economy. Businesses and consumers are feeling the pinch. Plus, labelled as a troublemaker by China, will Taiwan's new president face pressure from Beijing? And can he bring prosperity back to the island? Thousands of people killed or injured, unprecedented destruction, a lack of food, water, medicine and fuel, and the basic foundations of a functioning economy wiped out. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is worsening by the day, and the Strip is on the verge of famine. But more than 100 days since Israel launched its war, aid deliveries to Gaza are still limited. And the occupied West Bank is bearing the brunt of Israeli curbs on the movement of workers and goods. Al Jazeera's Nida Ibrahim begins our programme from Ramallah.
Palestinians in Gaza are struggling to survive. Most of the population has been forced to flee their homes. They have nothing, and basic necessities have become so scarce that prices are beyond the reach of most.
My son's trousers are torn and I can't afford to buy him new ones. They cost 50 or 60 shekels, which I can't afford. As for food, a bag of flour costs 200 shekels, which I can't buy.
Israel's war on Gaza has plunged the Strip into a deep recession. The World Bank says that by mid-November, around 2/3 of the population was out of work. Most economic activity has ground to a halt. Hospitals, communications and roads, more than half has been destroyed. More than 70% of commercial infrastructure lies in ruins. Rebuilding is expected to cost tens of billions of dollars. It's unclear who will foot the bill, but the Palestinian presidency has some suggestions.
Those who ruined Gaza, they have to be forced to rebuild Gaza. So the Americans are responsible. We hold America as the main responsible to find the right donors to rebuild Gaza.
While the war has devastated Gaza's economy, the occupied West Bank is also struggling. Israel is withholding tax revenues that are owed to the Palestinian Authority, and it's preventing Palestinian workers from crossing over into Israel.
Farms like this rely on the Israeli market. Restrictions imposed since the war began are hurting business.
We produce most of the West Bank's products. Peppers, courgettes, aubergine, everything comes from this region. When the crossings to Israel are closed, all of these goods go to the local markets, which causes the prices to drop. On some days, we don't sell anything.
The Palestinian Authority is the biggest employer in the occupied West Bank, but with no tax revenues coming in, it's had to cut salaries, inflicting more damage on the economy.
Israel's confiscation of Palestinian tax for more than 3 months constitutes almost 30% of the market movement. We had more than 200,000 people working in Israel, but after the war started, they were denied entry. All of those are important factors in the decline of the Palestinian economy.
As the war on Gaza drags on, the future looks bleaker for Palestine. An end to the war will only mark the beginning of the battle to rebuild. Nida Ibrahim, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
The financial cost of the war on Gaza, while clearly devastating, has yet to be calculated. But on the Israeli side, the cost of waging war has risen to almost $60 billion. Government spending is soaring in order to pay for bombs and bullets, and businesses are struggling as hundreds of thousands of workers have been called away to become soldiers. But revenues are dropping and Israelis are hunkering down. Now, if the war expands to the wider region, the expense could mount even further, as Stephanie Decker reports from West Jerusalem.
War isn't only devastating, it's also expensive. The war in Gaza has shaken up the Israeli government's finances, requiring revised budgets and billions more dollars. Israel's Prime Minister has said from day one that this will be a long fight, and it's costing.
At this moment, what is required, first of all, to cover the expenses of the war and to allow us to conduct the war in the coming year and complete it, including eliminating Hamas, returning our hostages, and restoring security in the north and the south so that residents can return.
Spending cuts have been made to various ministries to allocate more money to the military. The war is also having an effect on various key industries here. Tech accounts for more than half of all the nation's exports, making it the largest engine of the economy, and that's taken a hit. Many army reservists work in the tech sector. 350,000 have been called up, and that's the largest number in Israel's history. Around 120,000 people have been displaced from their homes, both along the border with Gaza and in the north along the border with Lebanon. The government needs to pay for their housing. It's estimated 20% of Israeli workers are out of economic activity. Tourism is flatlined. It's only a tiny slice of the economy, but many jobs and businesses rely on the sector. Construction practically ground to a halt after the war, when work permits of tens of thousands of Palestinians from the occupied West Bank were suspended.
We are in a serious economic crisis. We are going to have a huge hole in expanding debt of the country. We risk Israel losing its very good credit rating with the credit agencies. That is an enormous blow to the Israeli economy.
The Bank of Israel estimates that this war is going to cost the country around $58 billion. Its economy shrank 2% in the last 3 months of 2023, and it's costing $269 million a day for Israel to run this war. And that's without taking into consideration a possible escalation of a full-scale war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera, West Jerusalem, for Counting the Cost.
Let's speak now to Raja Khalidi in Ramallah. He's the Director General of the Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute. And from Tel Aviv, we're joined by Robbie Nathanson, who is the General Director of Macro, the Centre for Political Economics. Welcome, gentlemen, to you both. Raja, let's start with you. How would you describe life right now in Gaza?
Well, life is hardly a word that we can use to describe the sort of daily existence that people in Gaza are facing. The economy, if we can talk still about an economy, is at a subsistence level. Life is about finding food, medicine, and escaping bombing. So I don't, life is, I mean, here we want to talk about the economy, let's say, and the economy is pretty much reduced to zero, has already, is reduced to say 15% of its usual activity, and that's mainly in the services area that are public services that are still being provided, and some salaries perhaps. But basically the economy, the private economy, has ground to a halt. And we've turned to a different mode of production and consumption and economic activity for the moment.
Is there any estimation so far of the costs in terms of lost economic output, unemployment, trade, infrastructure, health, the education sectors, and so on?
Let's just briefly separate the production losses from the infrastructural losses. And in terms of the size of the Gaza economy, it was less than $3 billion a year. So it's already lost a quarter of that from the last quarter of 23. And one can assume more or less that this is an economy that will not produce value added in any significant way for the rest of this year, in the best of scenarios. So we're already talking there about $3 to $4 billion in lost output. This is not including the West Bank, which of course has been also reduced to a major, by significantly. In terms of reconstruction, I mean, even if we can assume that the relief that's estimated around $500 million a month can be provided over the next 6 to 9, 12 months, perhaps, the reconstruction of the infrastructure, the housing, the public service infrastructure and utilities is, we're talking at least of first estimates for housing stock is 15 billion. So I would, we're talking so far, we're looking so far at numbers that are going to go above $20 billion over a few years in terms of reconstruction and economic loss of a major blow to economic production.
Robbie, Israel's war is costing what? Some $270 million a day. And it's far from over, it would seem. Can Israel continue to keep fighting its war on Gaza?
Well, in the first place, I want to say that the Israeli economy is a strong economy, and it knows to face also crisis situation, like it was the case also with the corona Also in this situation, we have to consider that, for example, the debt service in Israel is 60% to the GDP, which is among the best around the world. Even before the war, according to index of the economies, Israel is the fourth best economy in the world in terms of performance, of macroeconomic performance. It had a surplus and abundance of payment, a surplus also in the tax income and the frame of the budget. So to say, when we also are facing the cause of this war, I think that for the time being, Israel can afford to finance the cost of the war and the medium and in the short, also in the medium term. The question is, of course, what will happen in the next and the longer term. But on the other side, we have also to consider other components which are connected to the cost of the war. First, of course, there are sectors that are directly affected, like tourism, like construction, like agriculture. And specific regions of the country that have been paralyzed, like the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Israel. But generally speaking, the economy is functioning. The industry is functioning, the high-tech sector is functioning, the services and also communication and financial services are functioning. Also the public sector.
Rabbi, all right, the economy is showing some resilience, as you say, but with the budget deficit expected to reach 7%, the nation's borrowing costs rising, its credit ratings at risk, can the economy keep holding up? I mean, what are we talking? You mentioned the medium to long term. How long can Israel keep this up?
Well, of course, it cannot keep the situation up indefinitely, but in terms of the planning of the strategy of the government in the medium term, I think that Israel can hold the situation also from the economic point of view. Recently, a budget has been passed, which is also quite considering significant cuts in the budget in order to cope with the deficit in the short term. Interest rates are going down, so to say, and this is something that can also encourage economic activity in the short term. And as I said, Israel can comfortably increase its debt service from 60% to 70% without damaging the international credibility. And perhaps pass this burden not for this generation, but for the next generation and the framework of the higher debt.
All right, Roger, we've been talking about Gaza so far in this discussion. What's been the impact of all of this on the economy of the occupied West Bank?
Actually, what we just heard about the Israeli economy is, in fact, provides a good backdrop, because we're talking about an economy which is like 150 times the size of the Gaza economy, so the Israeli economy, and of course, as was explained, has a whole range of policy instruments. So, on the other hand, the occupied West Bank in particular, but the Palestinian economy in general, is a fragile, open economy. It feels the shocks immediately. It has no shock absorbers, be it in terms of institutional policy measures or resources. So from the first day of the war, not only as we watch Gaza be pounded into the dust and its economy rendered effectively moot, the West Bank began to feel the various waves of Israeli policy measures. The first, of course, was the restriction of workers, the suspension or cessation of Palestinian workers being allowed to access Israeli markets. So that's already 180,000 workers, 20-something% of the West Bank labor force, bringing in approximately $300 million a month, close to $3.5 to $4 billion a year, which is almost 20% of the GNI or 15% of national income. So that was the first shock, and it continues not only to reverberate, but to deepen in terms of people have not yet been allowed to return, and we are assuming that we won't be going back to work in Israel in any major way. And on the other hand, now you have a related but similarly impressive crisis in the form of, as was mentioned in your report, the cutoff of clearance revenues. So due to the PA for these last 3 months, I believe was close to over $400 million in trade taxes that Israel usually transfers to the PA, but in the circumstances of the war, it was adding to its usual deductions, new unilateral deductions, supposedly to prevent money reaching Gaza. Anyhow, so the point is that that's another $400 million, which we should have had pumped into the market. So there is a collapse that has begun and will accelerate as we go
Gentlemen,
forward.
I'm afraid we must leave it. We're out of time. Raja Khalidi and Robbie Nathanson, many thanks indeed for being with us. Taiwan is a global semiconductor hub. Nations with an interest in the advanced chips have kept a close eye on the island's presidential election, so much so in China, which claims Taiwan as its own territory to be taken by force if necessary, a position that Taipei rejects. Taiwan's new president is in favour of independence, and his victory is being seen as a thorn in Beijing's side. But managing relations with China isn't the only challenge facing the new president. He's pledged to fix economic problems such as inequality and unemployment. Al Jazeera's Tony Cheng reports from Taipei.
Speaking to voters ahead of the elections here in Taiwan, there were two big issues at the forefront of everyone's mind. The first was China, angry rhetoric coming out of Beijing, an increase in tensions over the Taiwan Straits in recent years, and comments from Chinese President Xi Jinping that the return of Taiwan to China was inevitable. But people were also really concerned about the domestic economy, rising inflation, the lack of opportunities for young people. Well, the election is now resolved, but the winner was the man that Beijing certainly doesn't want to see in power. So what's that going to mean for the economy?
China is dealing with some unprecedented, economic situations, but they will try their best to keep everything under control. Yeah, so that they acknowledge the existence of the problems, and they will try to figure out some solutions for that.
But Taiwan has had an ace up its sleeve. The island produces about 60% of the world's semiconductors, vital computer chips essential for manufacturers around the world.
I think semiconductor is one factor contributing to the mutual willingness to cooperate, but this is not enough. If we only rely on semiconductor, I think Taiwan is doomed.
President-elect Lai Ching-te went so far as to mention specifically the semiconductor industry in his victory speech, saying that Taiwan must invest more. But more generally, people here are very aware that they've been right at the center of global attention for the last couple of weeks, and now the election is resolved. I think they're hoping that the focus will move elsewhere and they can get back to business. Tony Cheng, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost in Taipei.
Well, Taiwan and China have complicated political relations, but they're economically intertwined. Beijing has long been Taipei's largest trading partner, but Taiwanese investments into China plunged to their lowest level in more than 2 decades last year. As you can see here, they've dropped by almost 40% year on year to more than $3 billion. Investments in China peaked at almost $14 billion in 2010. Taiwanese companies are now boosting investment in the US, Europe, Japan, and other countries. Joining us now from Hong Kong is Gary Ng, who is a senior economist at Natixis, a research fellow also at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies. Good to have you with us, Gary. Economic issues like unemployment, inequality and housing affordability were, as we heard, major concerns to voters in this election. Do you think the new president can deliver on all of those?
Well, indeed, if you look at the situation in Taiwan right now, actually the economic growth will probably rebound slightly in the next 2 to 3 years because of the global cyclical rebound. But the biggest issue here is not about how much the economy grows, it's because of basically whether residents can actually feel this growth, because we have heard structural problems from inequality, housing problem, like very fast home prices growth, etc. I mean, all of these problems are basically something that has been rather long-term, and voters are actually finding solutions out of the latest administration. So this is indeed a very big challenge that Lai will need to face. But at the same time, we cannot forget that actually the DPP will not have the majority in the legislative yuan anymore. So this will probably make his life even harder.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how difficult it is going to be for the new president to get anything done, really.
We will see more political drama in Taiwan Legislative Council, so which basically means that we do expect that in some of the general policy, like basically on the support to semiconductor, there will not be too much resistance. However, for some of the other areas with more disagreement, like energy or social issues, it's quite hard to get things move forward. So therefore, it's quite likely that this sort of political dilemma in Taiwan will result in a slower potential growth.
Gary, you talked about social issues. I read that many commentators argue that with an aging population and a downturn in industrial production anyway, Taiwan should be completely reinventing its economic model. Do you agree?
If you first look at the economic structure of Taiwan, if you look at the past, let's say 2 to 3 decades, it's mainly a very semiconductor-driven industry. So it's quite hard to see how Taiwan can deviate from that in a very short time, because even if we look at some of the new sectors like artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and batteries, some of the things that Taiwan can actually do better in the future, they're all electronics related. So therefore, to that end, it's something that Taiwan should keep. But on the other hand, whether Taiwan should find it ways to diversify in developing its financial industry, pension, or like a tourism industry in a greater way, I totally agree, because if you put too many eggs in one basket, usually when you have a very huge headwinds coming, then there will be a cost to pay. So definitely, I think Taiwan should find a way to diversify.
You talk, Gary, about Taiwan's superiority, if you like, in electronics manufacturing. But China is ramping up its semiconductor industry, and semiconductors form a pillar of the Taiwanese economy. How much pressure is that going to put on Taiwan?
Well, indeed, if we look at how fast China is moving right now, I would say this is probably a greater threat than any, trade tensions that Taiwan may see from any tariff reduction from China, because this is really something that is structurally changing the relative comparative advantage between China and Taiwan, which will eventually give Beijing an even bigger bargaining chip in terms of managing this cross-strait relationship. So for Taiwan, the biggest challenge is that China has been using basically state-owned money, subsidies into chip manufacturing, which already see quite a bit of breakthrough, even though it's still not comparable to the West or Taiwan, etc. But this is something that is probably coming, and I wouldn't be surprised that in the future there will be an oversupply in the low-end chips, which will hurt some of the Taiwanese firms. And for the high-end, it really depends on how this competition goes.
And as for the political situation, Gary, Beijing has made it quite clear that this candidate was not the one that it wanted to see win this election. How do you think that is going to affect ongoing relations, which are already tense between Taipei and Beijing, and where does the US come into this?
Well, there could be many uncertainty, but one thing we're certain is that there will not be any constructive dialogue between the DPP and the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, simply because this is not the preferred candidate that they want. And of course, if you look at the statement that it issued, whether it was Taiwan or towards other government, indeed it's probably slightly not as intense as many people may have expected, which still shows that I think the status quo seems to be the most likely scenario that we see here. And for the U.S., with all these meetings with China right before the Taiwan's election, etc., I do also share the same view that no one really wants a war in the Taiwan Strait right now. So, of course, this competition will continue, the risking trend will continue, but probably there will also be a downside limit towards how far the two countries will go in terms of this geopolitical contest, and whether this will lead to an ultimate military conflict.
Really good to talk to you, Gary. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost. And that's our show for this week. If you want to comment on anything that you've seen, you can get in touch with us via X. I'm at A Finnegan on X. Please try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan. From the whole team here in Doha, thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.